Any attempt to restrict drinking and driving here is viewed by some as downright undemocratic.
It's kind of getting common when a fella can't put in a hard day's work, put in 11, 12 hours a day, and then get in your truck and at least drink 1 or 2 beers.
They're making it laws where you can't drink when you want to. You have to wear a seatbelt when you're driving. And pretty soon we're going to be a communist country.
I'm Ben Boyce, and this is the Dr. Junkie Show. Housekeeping. Yikes. As you might imagine, after last week's episode, I got a lot of email from people who appreciated my willingness to talk about the problems of religion. But boy, oh boy, those of you, including my dad, who said, hold on, you're going to get some mean comments in email, they're coming your way, you weren't wrong. I've been called a spiritual phony, spiritually illiterate, spiritually ignorant, a liar, mean, sinful, and cruel in the last week. And that's just from my family members. In all seriousness, I get it. When you believe something ideological and you hear something that threatens to make you rethink it in any way, as a human, the natural reaction is to freak out and try to focus on anything but what the person actually said. I mean, otherwise you might wind up changing your mind. I'd love to do more episodes on religion, but I also realize they're a drag for many of you and infuriating to some of you, and a bit painful for me in the aftermath. So, I don't know. Let me know what y'all think. For now, back to drugs. Today's episode is about alcohol, one of my favorite drugs because it's available, everywhere and typically seen as socially acceptable to consume, even in public. There's a reason for that, which I'll get to, and that's also a problem for people who struggle with drinking issues, which I'll also get to. But it's worth starting with what alcohol, or ethanol, the thing that gets you drunk, what it does in your brain. Now, our brains can be thought of as huge networks of interconnected switches called neurons. We have 100 billion neurons in our brain, an amount that I can't even fathom. And every thought, emotion, desire, memory, or dream you have is just a pattern of neurons firing that you've come to recognize as, say, love or hunger or fear. Your earliest classroom in grade school, your first family pet, that awesome Christmas present you got when you were 10. These are all literally just patterns of neurons firing that are unique to you. Although it's also similar to a lot of other people's patterns of fear or love or whatever, because our brains are all wired up similarly. Fear always comes from the fear centers of the brain, but my fear will also have different patterns of connections, a slightly different feeling than yours. Of course, your brain is way more complicated than that, but since I'm not a neuroscientist, and this is not a medical podcast offering any sort of medical advice, let's take the simplified version and just remind ourselves that these massive networks of neurons, they're all really smushed together. They're really close to each other. And even though the neurons themselves use electricity to fire, the ends of the neurons pass the message on to the next neuron in line through chemicals, not through electricity. So an electrical signal shoots down a neuron, gets to the ending, and then that electricity causes the neuron to release what we call a neurotransmitter from the end of the neuron. That neurotransmitter then slides across the empty space between neurons and sticks to the next neuron in line, where it starts the whole process yet again. And we only need 2 more pieces to complete this super simplified model. Lots of neurotransmitters and lots of chemicals that work alongside them. Each neuron generally specializes in just one type of neurotransmitter. You don't very often see a single neuron that can respond to dopamine, serotonin, and GABA, 3 neurotransmitters that are pretty well known. That way, if a neuron releases dopamine to activate the next neuron in line, it won't inadvertently activate the neurons next to it if they specialize in, say, serotonin or glutamate. So that's why we have so many different neurotransmitters. They all do different things to different neurons. One more piece, the chemical soup of electrically charged molecules floating around in your brain. There's chloride, potassium, sodium, calcium. But again, to keep this simple, some are positively charged and some are negatively charged. But they're all just floating around together, waiting for some force to gather a bunch of the positive charges and add them together inside a neuron until it fires. You see where this is going? Now, this all comes together when the neuron that just received the neurotransmitter from the previous neuron responds not by firing, but by opening or closing gateways into it. Channels, they're called, that let in specific ions with either positive or negative charges. So if a neurotransmitter, like dopamine, causes a neuron to open its ion channels and help it accept negatively charged ions, or to restrict positively charged ions, then that neurotransmitter will prevent the neuron from firing. And if, on the other hand, a neurotransmitter like, say, glutamate causes a neuron to open gates that let in a bunch of positively charged ions while restricting the negative ones, well, that neuron probably will fire. Times that by 100 billion, with some of your neurons literally firing hundreds of times per second, and you got a super basic model of the human brain. There it is. If you wind up going to medical school because of that top-tier description, you're welcome. Anyway, to keep this simplified model simple, let's reduce alcohol to the neurotransmitter that it mimics, or activates if you prefer, in the brain, GABA. GABA acts as a neuroinhibitor. When GABA attaches to a neuron, the neuron responds by reducing its charge, by letting in negatively charged ions and blocking positive ions. The result? We suddenly feel relaxed, unstressed, like our brain is taking a well-deserved break. Alcohol also blocks some of the effects of another neurotransmitter called glutamate, which is excitatory. Glutamate tends to make neurons fire when it binds to them, so alcohol disabling it works alongside that GABA action to make us feel even more relaxed. And alcohol also leads to lots of other neurotransmitters being released in what are usually called secondary effects. Like, you can imagine if some of those GABA neurons deactivated by alcohol acted as brakes on, say, a dopamine neuron. Then that dopamine neuron would fire once the GABA neurons deactivated the brake. Or, once you've been drinking for some time, you might feel relief and joy via dopamine when you take your first drink, but not from the alcohol, simply from the reward of getting a drink that you've been waiting for. But my goal here is to keep this basic, so let's stick with the model of alcohol as simply slowing down parts of the brain normally associated with anxiety, focus, attention, and stress. It takes the edge off, as they say. Valium and other benzodiazepines also act on the same system, the GABA system, which is why detoxing from alcohol often requires short treatments with these drugs to avoid possible deadly detox. If you've ever heard someone say that alcohol is the most damaging drug in our culture, that's not quite true, but the detox is part of the reason why people say that. Heroin detox is actually much more uncomfortable, but it seldom kills anyone. But so many systems run on GABA neurons that cutting off alcohol all at once after you've changed your body's baseline chemistry via tolerance, it can result in those now missing calm-me-down GABA neurotransmitters. Well, the neurons they're not attaching to anymore can all overreact and freak out because their normal dose of GABA isn't there. Again, this is a super simplified, not medical or technical model, but it's a general idea of what's going on in the brain. The point is, the reason people often say alcohol is the most dangerous or damaging drug in our culture, it's because it's so easy to get, which means it's way more widely used in unsafe ways than other drugs. Okay, enough with the biology, that's never really my forte. On to what alcohol actually means to us, culturally, spiritually, emotionally. More than 6% of all U.S. citizens currently meet the criteria for alcohol use disorder, so it clearly means something. Our cultural history is bound up with lots of drugs, but alcohol might be the most deeply embedded drug in our history. There are some evolutionary biologists who actually believe we wouldn't even be here as a species if it weren't for our ability to metabolize much higher quantities of ethanol than other species. After all, ethanol is poison in many regards, especially to those other species. So during times of famine, our ability to drink large quantities of it without dying could have opened up food supplies that other animals ignored, like rotting fruit that would not only fill us up, but also catch us a buzz. During the early eras of civilization, especially in the United States, our ability to consume large amounts of ethanol made it possible to drink beer with every meal and avoid the contaminated water alternative. Beer won't brew correctly if the water's contaminated, and much of the water available back in the day got people really sick. So drinking beer was like drinking certified clean water with a kick. Now, like most drugs, alcohol is a substance we've evolved alongside, and that's important. We've selectively farmed plants to create strains we enjoy. We've embedded it into our social rituals and our rites of passage. And we've distilled it in a capitalist attempt to maximize profits. It's a metonym of U.S. neoliberal culture, a small thing that represents the whole. In that last part, as I've talked about lots on this podcast, it changed a lot of how we interact with alcohol when we took the chemical we'd had for thousands of years, namely beer and wine, and we started distilling it into a much more potent form of ethanol that got us much more drunk. Now let's dive into the cultural history a bit deeper, because it's no joke to say that all U.S. citizens drank beer every day with every meal, including kids. In England in the 1600s, every person on average drank around 3 liters of alcohol a day, mainly beer, and it was really common to give alcohol away and to use it in social settings. During the 1758 election for a local position prior to his presidency, George Washington gave his voters 144 gallons of alcohol, which amounted to about half a gallon per voter, and he won, shades of Elon Musk's $1 million giveaways. Alcohol used to be incorporated into everything: church, family life, social gatherings, even work. Anytime people got together, they would drink. There's a lot I would hate about time travel to the 19th century, mostly how awful I'm sure everybody generally smelled, but I think I'd enjoy this particular aspect of culture. It was, in many historical accounts, considered rude to refuse a drink when offered. My kind of America. Since most work prior to industrialization in the late 1800s was done in one's home, it wasn't a big deal even when somebody struggled with overindulgence or addiction to alcohol, because they didn't mess up the party for everyone else most of the time. Drunk Tommy wasn't driving his car into the lobby of the Hilton because cars didn't exist, streets didn't exist, the Hilton didn't exist. Capitalism hadn't yet turned our society into a web of intersecting business relationships that must run smoothly, economically, and on time to avoid mass profit loss. Not yet. Everything started to change around the middle to the late 1800s as industrialization was growing and heavy machinery, moving vehicles, paved roads, industrialized cities, mass production. These things were creating a situation in which drunk people in public were suddenly a problem. So up came temperance movements and laws restricting vice. Surprise, as always, aimed at the poor and the working class, whose sobriety was seen as vital to the continuation of capitalist growth. We can't have those damn factory workers showing up drunk and crushing their fingers for their 2 cents per hour. Our shipments might get delayed. Maine passed the first alcohol restrictions in the country in 1851, but it wasn't until after the Civil War that the temperance movement and, relatedly, industrialization, that they really kicked into high gear, supercharged by religious fanaticism and, surprise again, fear-mongering using media. Newspaper stories that would describe things like recently released, dangerous, evil, drugged-up, ex-enslaved people. And then in 1913, the 16th Amendment passed, which allowed the federal government to collect income tax that could quickly replace what was then the only real source of federal taxation in the country: alcohol imports. Before that happened, alcohol prohibition in the U.S. couldn't have been a thing without bankrupting the government. But with this new source of revenue, income tax, prohibition suddenly became an option, And rich industry owners like Ford, Rockefeller, Carnegie, they pushed hard for prohibition to protect their docile workforce. By 1919, the temperance movement came to a head with the passage of prohibition via the 18th Amendment. All alcohol above 0.05% was outlawed. Boo. Can you imagine how much beer you'd have to drink to catch a buzz? And it was all because alcohol posed a threat to the emerging mega-millionaire system of neoliberal capitalism, a theme that's still with us today. As much as it's often told, though, as a story of religious zealots pressing temperance norms upon an unwilling public, the story of prohibition, like many of our stories in U.S. history, it's much more informed by racism and classism than by holiness and rationality. We've long been a culture looking for the next reason to blame poor people for their lot in life. And in the 1920s, World War I had just ended, and World War II was already gearing up, and Germany wasn't exactly seen by the rest of the world as the good guys. In the mid-1800s, a large population of German immigrants had moved to the U.S. Midwest. Many of them started brewing beer on a massive scale, and their names might ring a bell. Miller, Schultz, Busch. Their industrialization of beer was a big part of the U.S.'s original move away from social drinking, like I described earlier, and towards more problematic drinking habits that would become more normalized later on in response to industrialization. I'm talking here about the drinker who drinks his troubles away after work. The world of the 1800s was still socially oriented. Early taverns, for example, featured large round tables, and you could go there for face-to-face interactions. Many saloons at the time continued to serve as the town square of sorts. They had social services like churches, business meetings, check cashing services, groceries. They were a place where the alienation of industrial society could actually be eased with socialization and a couple beers. The saloons that started to show up near the turn of the century, well, these included this new invention called a bar, where drinkers faced the bartender and drank not to socialize, but to medicate. This form of consumption didn't pose the same threat to capitalism. There were no more groups of community members drinking a few beers and talking about how to protect themselves from the dangers of industrialization. They weren't trying to unionize. These were people throwing a few down after work to get gassed up enough to go back in tomorrow. But as you might imagine, saloons were also known as places where lots of working class and poor people hung out. And like every war on drugs in U.S. history, that's the real reason substances are always outlawed. The war on drugs is never about drugs. It's always about class. It's kind of wild to go back and read some of the celebratory speeches given by people when the 18th Amendment passed, just because of how ridiculously dreamy they are. Reverend Billy Sunday said, "The reign of tears is over. The slums will soon be only a memory. We will turn our prisons into factories and our jails into storehouses and corn cribs." And Andrew Volstead, the namesake of the laws passed, the Volstead Act, to provide power to enforce the 18th Amendment, he said, quote, "All men will walk with their heads high. All women will smile. All children will laugh. The doors of hell will forever be closed." Right. But in some ways, prohibition did work, kind of. We drank less per capita during the 20s than before or after, but we also saw a lot of people injured or killed from drinking booze in the form of cleaning products or cosmetics. As an example, in 1930, it was reported that 50,000 people were paralyzed for life after drinking Jamaican ginger extract contaminated with chemicals used in photography. And when people did drink during Prohibition, they were also less likely to drink beer or wine, and more likely to drink strong moonshine that was distilled illegally, the iron law of Prohibition at work. Anytime you outlaw an intoxicating substance, you can expect lots of issues to show up from people using unsafe sources of that substance. Now, Prohibition also became the first chapter of the drug war's non-stop targeting of poor people and people of color. While rich white folks often hardly knew that Prohibition was even a thing, lower-income non-white people became targets of arrest-happy enforcement units. The Harrison Act, America's first anti-drug law, passed in 1914, and by 1930, a full 35% of the people in prison in America were there for drug charges. The KKK resurged in the 1920s as well, and they had a new mission: to enforce the holy laws of prohibition against non-white community members. And then there was Al Capone and other organized crime figures who became enshrined in our history because of prohibition. The war on drugs, from its origins, was a war that created crime bosses and underworld industries that never would have existed without it. Luckily, things wouldn't stay that way for long. See, something else was changing in the United States. The 1920s became the early years of what would later be called consumerism. Our attitudes changed, and we started to define ourselves by the products we consumed and the way those products made us feel. Check out my Nike shirt, bro. And when the Great Depression in the late 1920s hit, a lot of the people who had previously supported prohibition changed their minds because they saw in it a source of new tax revenue for the government, a way to change things. Add to that women winning the vote in 1920, and the fact that a big part of their freedom also seemed to be represented in their desire to consume the same products as men, which had before been largely restricted to just men. Those products included things like alcohol and cigarettes. The 18th Amendment's days were numbered. So in 1933, we brought back booze with the 21st Amendment, which undid the 18th Amendment. And here's where capitalism starts to shape our cultural attitude about drugs in a new way, a more capitalistic way. By the mid-1900s, those who had been employed in factory labor were worn out and overworked. But instead of alcohol re-emerging as a threat to industry, it actually became seen as a boon to industry, as a way for those exhausted, unfulfilled workers to medicate themselves after work in an effort to recharge just enough to return to the grind the next day, a model that persists to this day. Frederick Engels said this of the era: "The worker comes home from his job tired and listless. He finds a residence that is without all comfort, dank, inhospitable, dirty. He urgently needs something to restore him. He must have something that compensates for his toil and makes the prospect of the next day tolerable. His tense, harried, hypochondrial mood, which is the product of unhealthy conditions, is exacerbated to the point of unendurability by his overall circumstances in life, the precariousness of his existence, his dependency on all manner of contingencies, and his inability to introduce any degree of security into his life. His need for companionship can be satisfied only in the tavern, since he and his friends have no other place to meet. And all told, how is the worker not to have the strongest temptation towards inebriation? How could he possibly be in any state to resist the allures of drink? On the contrary, it's a moral and physical necessity that under these circumstances, a great number of workers must succumb to drink." Talk about irony. Alcohol had been defeated and banished by big industry, and now alcohol was being reintroduced as a way to get through the day, as a supporter of capitalism. And as neoliberalism does with all conditions suffered by its citizens, the blame for any alcohol-related problems moved from prior understandings of alcohol itself being the problem to an updated neoliberal understanding that the individual was the problem. The term alcoholic came to be a stamp of this move. AA showed up in 1935, and they cemented this understanding of addiction by putting all of the responsibility onto the addicted person and requiring a religious, docile acceptance of Christian doctrine dressed up in secular slacks for what they called recovery. And of course, just like with all of the other conditions produced by late-stage capitalism, anxiety, depression, alienation, loneliness, the blame came to rest not on the environment which produces these conditions, but solely on the individuals who experience them. Since then, things have slowly but steadily changed, from industry standards to advertising laws to DUI laws and social norms. You heard a clip of somebody complaining about those DUI laws in the 70s when they were first introduced at the beginning of the show. And these changes were seldom popular when they took effect. And things will continue to change, although the idea of the US ever minimizing alcohol in our culture seems impossible unless we first found ourselves moving beyond our neoliberal ethic, which makes workers feel like valued market commodities who are competing in a labor market. It's natural to want to medicate in that situation. It'd be kind of weird if we didn't want to. I think I might take this cultural pathway a bit further in some upcoming episodes and talk about caffeine, which was nearly outlawed by the US government in the early 1900s, and about opium, which is still my favorite drug. So drop me a line and let me know what you think. Until then, love yourselves and the addicted people in your life. I'm Ben Boyce.
Sir, have you been drinking?
Yes, I have. I've had 5 or 6 small batch bourbons.
That's a lot. I'm going to have to ask you to take a breathalyzer test.